You just have to look at the map, but you've got a much longer freshwater migration on the Fraser system than you do in any of the 9 Bristol Bay rivers, correct?
Yes, for some of the stocks, some have a short migration on the Fraser as well, but a lot of the bigger ones have long migrations.
Quite so. And the significance of that, and there's been some evidence about this, but from the point of hitting the fresh water in the Fraser or the rivers in Bristol Bay, the fish are on a mission to spawn and then die, correct?
That's correct.
And the longer they have between entering that freshwater environment and getting to the spawning grounds and spawning, the more chance there is for parasites and any other problems to arise and cause them to die before they get to the spawning ground, correct?
That's correct.
I just want to ask a couple of quick questions about tower counts, or the use of towers. That's done in Bristol Bay. As I understand it, and you alluded to this, it's literally a tower that someone stands at the top of and counts the fish.
Yes.
And they use a clicker that you would see traffic monitors and so forth use, do they?
I think some form of keeping track of the numbers that go by.
Now, as I understand it, up on the Bristol Bay, firstly, these towers are at the mouth or near the mouths of the river, aren't they?
They're very low down, yes. They're wherever they can find the right substrate, stream width, not too much depth, so that they can have a good vision into the water column.
All right. And as I understand it, where the towers are, the water's shallow and the water's clear. Is that right?
That's the idea, yeah.
And that's quite not what the Fraser is.
The lower Fraser doesn't look at all like that, no.
You can't see a fish in the Fraser like you can up at Bristol Bay.
You couldn't see your hand if your elbow was at the surface.
All right. And you allude to this at page 168 of your paper, and I won't take you to it in the interest of time, but do you agree with me that Bristol Bay can afford to have a fixed escapement approach because the variability year to year is much less, far less than on the Fraser?
Yes, they have much less variability in returns for the different stocks.
Now, one thing that I think we haven't spoken of already is to do with the composition of the age of fish returning up at Bristol Bay. You know who Mike Lapointe is, chief biologist at PSC, correct?
Yes.
He gave evidence earlier, and specifically on January 19th, and we don't need to go to this, but he gave evidence about key biological, geographical, and fisheries management's decisions and the differences and comparing them as between Bristol Bay and the Fraser. And he cited that a key fundamental difference is the fact that the portfolio of Bristol Bay sockeye are composed of fish that return at various ages, not just the mostly 4-year-olds that come with the Fraser stockeye. And he said that's a key reason why Bristol Bay sockeye returns are more robust and less variable than the Fraser. Do you agree with him on that?
Yeah, I think you're looking at Bristol Bay as a total unit and Fraser as a total unit. That's the reason. If you look within Bristol Bay at specific populations, I wanted to make it clear from my previous statement that it's less variable. There's actually more variability within individual populations over a number of years because of the size of the populations in Bristol Bay. You could get from a few, very few million up to 25 million returns from a single one of these districts.
All right. A couple of quick questions about the mission hydroacoustic monitoring. You're familiar with the operation there, are you, that the Pacific Salmon Commission runs?
Yes, I am.
And while location can be everything, and it is a good location in terms of its position on the map, as a geographic layout and the shape of the river basin, it's not very good for hydroacoustics, is it?
No, that's what the hydroacoustics people have determined through a number of reviews that I've read.
All right. And does that underline, in your mind, the need for ever improving the technology that's there as new technology becomes available?
Yes, and that's what I understand they're doing with using more Ditson systems, a different type of acoustic system than what they've been using in the past.
All right. And does it also lead to the need for other means of estimating in season? In other words, to support Mission, because Mission itself is notoriously got bias in it, high or low, or other errors.
Yeah, so your choice is either put together something that's going to replace Mission, be better than Mission, or put in a secondary system like has been done at Quaylark to help cross-check Mission.
All right. But anywhere near Mission is going to have the same kind of river basin shape problems that Mission has, isn't it?
Yeah, you're not going to find any better site for acoustics probably in the Mission area than the one at the current site.
Do you also agree with me that it underlines the need for having pre-season forecasting in place to assist with cross-checking, if I could put it that way?
Well, I don't think they're using the preseason forecast to cross-check Mission or the test fishery results, because there's more confidence that the test fisheries combined with, even with the problems at Mission, there's more confidence, at least early in the run, prior to the arrival of late run fish, there's more confidence that they're going to get closer to the actual returns by doing the in-season test fisheries than they will by relying on the preseason forecast.
All right. And almost finally, I want to take you to your recommendations, and specifically recommendation 3. And your recommendation there, this is on page 173. Your recommendation there is that the analytical resources currently allocated to preparing pre-season forecasts should be reallocated to defining a clear set of escapement goals and in-season management models that will assist managers in fisheries planning and the achievement of these goals. Now, I'd like to, in light of what you've said in evidence so far, ask if you would consider amending that, because as I understand you, you're not saying to shut down pre-season forecasting. You've got some questions about it, but you see it as a valuable tool, and yet you recommend that it be stopped.
Yeah, no, it probably was a mistake not to say some of the analytical resources as opposed to all.
All right.
Yeah.
So you're not shutting it, you're not proposing to shut it down, you're simply questioning how much.
Yeah, it's on a priority basis. The other ones would have a as high or higher priority, and there's maybe ways of doing it simpler so that we can use these limited DFO resources and limited people who have these capabilities to. And Sue Grant, by the way, was the person who prepared the initial submission last fall on setting benchmarks. She and a bunch of others working with her for Fraser Sockeye. So obviously you're relying on the same people for multiple tasks.
Yes, and I think you're alluding to a paper that has been talked about here that's upcoming in publication, but not yet. With that, and my final question, if in fact the amount of resources put into pre-season forecasting is fairly modest in the scheme of things, then that would bode for leaving that in place, because pre-season forecasting is useful. You wouldn't cut it back to zero, and if it's already modest, there wouldn't be much need or room to cut it back then. Would you agree with me on that?
Yeah, if it doesn't amount to much, yeah, you're not gaining a lot by stopping it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. English.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. The next questioner will be Mr. Leadham for the Conservation Coalition.
Leadham, initial T, appearing as counsel for the Conservation Coalition. I'd like to focus predominantly on your recommendations, Mr. English. And I will ask Mr. Lund to bring up pages 173 and 174 if he could. The first one I'd like to begin with is actually number 6. in which you advocate that escapement goals be put into place for each indicator, stock, and run timing group. And then you go on to suggest that there should be at least 2 different lower benchmarks and 2 upper benchmarks for each cyclic stock. So what I'm trying to understand is why you would have the benchmarks, why you would have 2 benchmarks. Is that only because the cyclical stock would be that in the good year, you would want that to be a different one than it would be in an off year? Is that what you're driving at
Yes,
there?
yes.
And I noted that there was some discussion in some of the recommendations that were critiqued by Dr. Sean Cox about this concept. And maybe I can just take you there.
Sure.
If we can have Appendix M. And I believe the comments from Dr. Sean Cox would be found at M32, Mr. Lunn. Now, firstly, you are aware that Dr. Sean Cox is a professor at Simon Fraser University, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And he is a professor in the Fisheries Science and Management Department at SFU, is that not right?
Yes, correct.
His focus is primarily on aquatic conservation and management of human impacts on aquatic ecosystems. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
So he says there, that I agree that having a clear set of easily understood operating rules would benefit everyone involved in Fraser River sockeye fisheries, including harvesters. However, the authors could be more specific about what they mean and what potential consequences might follow from their recommendations. For example, 1, do they mean stock-specific fixed escapement goals? And 2, how well could those be determined? And 3, how would 19 stock-specific escapement goals make it easier to manage fisheries, given that many stocks will sometimes have returns below these goals? All of which I think are very excellent questions. And then you go on to provide an answer to those comments and the critiques of Dr. Cox. And this is where I'm a little bit confused, and perhaps you can help me. You say what we are suggesting is similar to what is proposed under the wild salmon policy. So let me just stop you there. Obviously, you're quite familiar with the wild salmon policy and what it says in terms of establishing benchmarks, lower benchmarks, upper benchmarks for each of the conservation units. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And so you go on to say we're recommending that a limit reference point, LRP, and a target reference point be defined by cycle year for each indicator stock. So let me just stop there because I've seen these terms before, LRPs and TRPs, and they arise in the context of MSC certification, do they not?
That's correct, yes.
And limit reference points are points at which there's absolutely no fishing occurs. Is that your understanding of what an LRP dictates or how it's to be interpreted?
Well, the way it's proposed to be used is that as you approach a limit reference point, you start severely curtailing fisheries. If you have runs below that, then you would not have fisheries.
Right. And so are you equating then limit reference points as they're understood in the MSC process to lower benchmarks as they're understood in the wild salmon policy and as they are defined for conservation units?
Yeah, that's they could be interpreted that way, and that could be a proposal to, depending on how the lower benchmarks were defined, they could meet the criteria for a limit reference point as defined by MSC.
Right. And you're quite familiar with the MSC process, are you not? Because you were one of the scientists that was involved in the certification process for Fraser River sockeye, were you not?
I was, and I'm more familiar than I want to be.
All right. I take it by your answer that it was a quite arduous process, was it not?
It was very involved, took over 10 years to get to where we are today. And it's not done yet because it keeps on going. It's one of those nightmares you keep having again and again.
Well, let's hope that we don't have that nightmare by some of the things that we're going into in the context of this inquiry. Although we seem to be repeating patterns of looking at Fraser River sockeye time and time again based upon other inquiries that have preceded this one. You're aware of that, are you not?
Yeah, no, there's been lots of these.
So what I'm curious about, and this is what's driving me, is how are we going to meld the wild salmon policy and the conservation units into what we see in the existing structure with 19 indicator stocks, and these are the 19 indicator stocks that DFO has defined. Is that correct?
Yes.
And we know, for example, that if we look at some of the conservation units that have been defined in the wild salmon policy, at least so far, it appears to be anywhere in the range of something like, I have to approximate because no one has ever actually come and said there are a definite number of conservation units, but it seems to be around 30 or so. Does that accord with your understanding as well? Yeah,
there are 25 conservation units that are very clear. There's a number of others that there's ongoing debate about whether they qualify as conservation units, depending on who you talk with. And there could be up to 36, as I'm aware of, as the largest number for conservation units for Fraser sockeye.
Right. So if you were to actually take your answer there, in order to be more accurate, even though we only have the 19 indicator stocks, we really should be focusing upon the actual number of conservation units that are finally defined in the work that's being done by Sue Grant and Kerry Holt and others. Is that fair to say?
Well, the focus for setting goals should be one that's based on available information, and there's not much point in pulling a goal out of the midair because it doesn't do anybody any good to do that. So the stocks where we have good, reliable information are obviously the first place to start in setting these goals, and so what I'm recommending here, and I've said it earlier today, that the key is to find the goals. These limit and target reference points might refer to those goals. In fact, in some places, limit reference points are defined in terms of your ultimate goal. And target reference points might be the escapement goal. The reason why I use these terms is because there's a link to a process which is underway through MSC certification, and it's an approach that has been proposed not just for salmon fisheries, but for a variety of fisheries across the world, is specifically stating what your goals are and identifying the point when you are going to, say, okay, at this point, we're not going to have fisheries.
And that's what I think everyone in this room is concerned about, is some certainty about when can harvesters actually go out and fish and when they cannot. And from the perspective of my clients who are conservationists, they want to know when the fish will be saved, when in other words, conservation will be the superseding factor, and when will harvesting be allowed to occur. I think all of us are striving for that. So can you help us to see how we can arrive at that point? Is there a methodology that you are proposing here or elsewhere that would allow us to get to a stage where everyone in this room with their disparate interests would be able to focus upon a finite point and say, okay, we're fine with fishing after this point, but if it goes below that point, we're not fine with it. Mm-hmm. Can you help us see how we can arrive there?
I think the problem that you referred to at the beginning was that we have multiple stocks, and so we have multiple goals, not just one goal we're striving for the entire Fraser. But the first place to start is with the information we have on our 19 well-assessed and monitored for a long time period stocks. So define the goals for those very clearly. They're all part of one or another one of the run timing groups. So you're going to have to pull those goals together for a specific run timing group and say, this is how, when we're managing these stocks together, as long as we have fisheries like we have today, mixed stock fisheries, we're going to have to deal with these multiple goals for within a timing group. And that's the level where you'll have to deal with the trade-off question of you have a goal which says where you want to be, how fast you are going to get there, how strict your fisheries regulations are to protect the fish from harvest will determine the time period it takes you to go from where you are today, which a number of these stocks they're below what a reasonable goal might be, so you have to increase them. And the speed, so it's determined by how strict your fisheries regulations are, but also on productivity, which you've heard a lot about how productive the stocks are, how many return in a given year. So if you have a really strong return on one of these populations, then backing off and not harvesting a lot of it will get you to your goal faster because you've got a lot of fish. In a low abundance year, you could back off for a long time, or low abundance, low productivity, and you may not get any closer to your goal.
Well, one of the solutions to the dilemma that we're all are facing now would be to somehow try to segregate out the units of concern, the conservation units that are in that red zone or that are endangered or whatever language you may wish to use, trying to segregate those out in some fashion from the actual conservation units that can be harvested and will come back and are sustainable. Isn't that one potential solution to the dilemma that we're in?
Yeah, definitely looking for opportunities where you have a surplus, if you like, a number of fish that can be harvested of a specific stock, where you can harvest those fish without impacting the other ones you're trying to protect.
Right, because if we stick with the mixed stock fishery that we have now, we're going to end up not making anybody happy, because the conservationists are not going to be happy because the conservation units are going to decline. Cultus Lake and other units are going to decline because there will be incidental catches of those conservation units. And on the other hand, the commercial fisheries are not going to be very happy because they're not allowed to fish those stocks that are sustainable. So really what we're after is finding some solution to this dilemma. And I can't see how we can continue with the same model of fishery that we've been espousing for decades now and come up with a solution. Am I just completely off base with my reasoning and logic here?
No, you're correct in that you can't keep doing the same thing and hoping for a different result. I think that's the definition of insanity, right?
Right.
So, clearly you have to make some changes to how we execute the fisheries in order to get to these goals. But right now, at this point in time, we don't even have the goals defined. And this is a fundamental problem. It's not to say that nobody has a goal or nobody has some idea of what we're striving for, but we haven't explicitly defined these goals for these populations.
All right.
And
so that's a starting point.
yeah.
Well, this, Mr. Commissioner, since I don't think you want to go into overtime, is probably the end point for today.
Maybe we could just take a minute, Mr. Leedham, to follow up on that last answer, and it might help me, I'm sure it'll help others. I'm still not sure I understand what you mean by defining goals. I know what goals are, For example, let's say in a corporate setting, your company wishes to generate $5 million in revenue. That's your goal next year or in 2011. So you can take action as best you can to achieve that goal. But your report and the evidence of others has brought home to us the complexity of this fishery, both the human dynamic involved as well as the natural dynamic involved. So when you say setting goals, I may be the only one in the room, sir, that doesn't understand what you're talking about in that limited area. In other words, being able to set a goal for a CU in terms of its sustainability, where we want to get to, versus reacting to nature and how it plays out in terms of the abundance of the fish, as well as all of the human dynamics that are involved in this fishery, be it those who harvest the resource or those who perhaps through their conduct on the land or in the water have an impact on the resource. So if you could just explain to me what you mean by, I think you said we have to make changes to the model, but we have to explicitly define the goals. I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, in the case of sockeye and in other salmon species, there are numbers of spawners that we would like to see in the spawning grounds for a specific stock. And in the case of sockeye, it could be because there's an estimate of rearing capacity for a lake. So the lake will support so many juvenile sockeye. And so we'll look at the spawning grounds around the lake and say, okay, if we look at average egg or survivorship from adults to fry, and this many adults will produce this many fry that will then go into the lake, and that will fully seed that habitat. And if that's the goal, is to fully seed the habitat, taking into consideration the other species that may also occupy that habitat, that could be the goal we're talking about here. We want to see this habitat fully seeded because then it'll produce the maximum amount of fish that particular lake can produce. Those fish will still be vulnerable to survivorship once they leave the lake and also within the lake, but we at least seed the habitat like a farmer seeding his complete field, not just half of it. And then those fish go out and rear and come back from the ocean, and presumably if we've done a good job of putting the right number of fish on the spawning grounds, we'll get a better return. So there'll be more opportunities for harvest. And how you manage the harvest is in terms of how you distribute it, how you have the trade-offs between the productive stocks and the non-productive stocks is the second challenge once you have the fish coming back. And you define them as goals because you're saying for each of these populations, this is where we'd like to be. So what actions are you prepared to take to get there? And some populations, there may be some cold hard facts that this may be where we'd like to be, but we can never get there or we can't get there in the current regime because there's just not enough survivorship. So that's where you may have to step in and take other actions like it's being done at Cultus, where you have enhancement, other habitat alterations, predator removal. You have to take other actions to give the fish a better chance at coming back to what your goal is.
And do I understand you to be saying to me and to the participants that at the present time, within the structure of the management of the sockeye fishery in the Fraser, that model that you've just described is not used?
Yeah, it's not explicitly stated that these are the escapement goals for each of these populations.
You may have a follow-up to that, Mr. Liam. I'm content to wait a few minutes if you'd like to just follow up to that.
Well, I do have one follow-up question to that. When you use the terminology escapement goals, I just want to make it clear in my mind that are you equating that with the setting of benchmarks and the setting of limit reference points and target reference points? Are you defining that in the same way?
Well, it's most similar to a target reference point. It's where you want to be with a particular stock. A limit reference point is going to be at a point much less than your goal in most places, because you recognize that you're not going to get immediately to your goal on every population, and for social reasons you don't want to curtail fisheries entirely until you reach the goal. The goal is just like in the corporate sense, it's something you strive for over time. You're not instantaneously expecting you're going to achieve your goal.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you very much.
Hearing is now adjourned for the day and will resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.